Hello and welcome to the Agroplus 2023 A Year in Review presentation. I'm Lyle Jensen, agronomist for Agroplus, and this is something I try to put together at the end of every season to highlight and show some of the troubles we had during the season. So let's get into it here. This presentation is going to be focusing on dryland. To include irrigation in here would make it a significantly longer presentation. Winter weather, we don't like it, but we still have to talk about it. You can see here on our temperature chart for the winter, this is all off the Nobleford weather station. I'm only going to use this weather station just because of the variable rainfall amounts we got this season. Skipping between weather stations will show radically different data. So I'm just going to be using this one weather station, but you can see here in end of December, we get our big snowfall event of the winter there, cold temperatures, again end of January, again near the end of February. Then after that, it kind of warms up, and you can see once we start getting into March here, we really do have some pretty good daytime temperatures, and our average temperature kind of starts to tread that freezing line there. So overall, we did have fairly consistent freezing temperatures throughout the winter. Few real Chinook events, kept our soil moisture frozen up for most of the winter and well into March, and early April was when we started to get Chinook events with some soil warming. Overall limited moisture during the winter, little to no recharge of soil moisture reserves over winter, partially because the soil remained frozen consistently all winter long. Early April moisture did give us some usable moisture for seeding, and it did seem like we had a very abrupt change to spring in April. And also lots of late winter fog had people predicting a very wet summer, and of course that did not happen. Here you can see by March 18th, as with snow started to recede, we did have some winter annuals underneath the snow, such as this stinkweed here. This is kochia on March 30th. This was germinating on warm south-facing hillsides, but just to show you how early it did start to come up. By April 5th, male gophers were emerging, baiting season starts. You can actually already see in this picture there is some green grass starting to come up. This would have been on like a natural grazeland pasture. So once that grass starts to green up, it gets tougher and tougher for gophers to be attracted to the bait. By middle of the April, it started to feel like spring, with winter wheat breaking its dormancy across the area. Here you can see April 20th, we had Russian thistle emerging. And we had cleavers. These would have been overwintered cleavers, and these were already 4 or 5 inch diameter cleavers on April 20th, when we haven't even started seeding yet. Grasshopper eggs and overwintered adults started showing up as soon as field work began. Pictured here is northern green-striped grasshopper, relatively harmless compared to the others. I found that on April 24th, and the grasshopper eggs on the left was a picture sent to me from a customer in Foremost on the 24th as well. Seeding began as early as April 20th. In the drone shot here, you can see that was, I believe that was April 23rd. You can see we're already in dusty conditions there. Soil temperature did hit the ideal 5 degrees Celsius on average by April 24th, although a lot of guys started just a little bit before then. Initially, there was decent surface soil moisture, and by that I mean in the upper few inches, from late snow events. Fields did look clean from a distance because there was kind of a bit of a lack of fall annual weeds for the most part, like the big flicks weed that we're used to seeing. So they did look clean from a distance, but there was lots of very small germinating spring weeds like kochia and Russian thistle, which can be very hard to see. Customers were advised to seed as deep as reasonably possible to stay in the moisture. And overall, seeding season went pretty smoothly with very little weather interruptions. There was no big, general 3-day rains that slowed everything down for a week. Here you can see on our temperature chart, you can see our average temperature after April 21st really does stay above freezing. But you can really see we've got a big spread between the daily highs and lows from the 21st into early May. And this had a few different effects. Reduced the effectiveness of our pre-burn herbicides and caused stress to emerging plants, basically by delaying emergence, delaying germination. High daytime temperatures by the end of April caused surface soil moisture to rapidly deplete. We didn't have too many really high wind events at that time, but we did seem to have a pretty steady 20 to 30 km/h breeze for days at a time, which would rapidly reduce surface soil moisture. So there was a few showers, like on May 8th, you can see on this chart, that did provide some relief. Depending on the area you're in, that shower may have been a day earlier or a day or two later. There was no big widespread general rains in the spring of this season. As moisture conditions continued to worsen, some dryland seeding plans changed. Some guys did drop canola and go in with barley where they could safely seed it deeper to get into that moisture. And some of the fields planted, mid to late May did struggle to germinate and emerge, especially canola. However, not all of them. Some of them did get enough rainfall that they actually came up very good. So that's just kind of a broad generalization. Early season issues. What were the first things we saw? Of course, you can see by this picture, grasshoppers were one of them. These pictures were from May 7th. You can see some of these little grasshoppers. They've probably only been emerged from the eggs for maybe a day or two. They're already being attracted into these dandelion flowers as well into the barley. Down on the bottom you can see you got a cutworm with some grasshopper eggs, and bottom right there, a nice big old fat wireworm, which are pretty normal to find. Grasshopper nymphs started to emerge early to mid-May. This is a contrast to the 2022 season where grasshoppers emerged much later because the soil temperature was colder. So we didn't have widespread problems with them really until we were into June. Quickly became a problem in many areas as newly emerged cereals were chewed off because the grasshoppers were there as the crops were starting to emerge. So that was a key difference from last year. Early control along the headlands and hotspots with EcoBrand or Coragen was key to control. Contact insecticides were quite commonly used as well. Things like Decis or Silencer Matador. However, you really don't get any sort of flushing control, which is important in the spring when those guys are just hatching from eggs as quick as you could spray. There was a few spotty problems with cutworms. There was some hot spots here and there, but nothing really severe. No, problems severe enough to justify spraying entire fields kind of thing. Wireworms were present, but didn't seem severe compared to the weather issues. Probably a lot of this too is because a lot of my customer base were using, pretty good seed treatments these days, and we can effectively fight wireworms. Flea beetles were very heavy in many areas. I didn't see as many problems as I did in 2022. I think the Buteo seed treatment on canola did a very good job this year. I had some hot spots along the edges of my fields, but it never really progressed into the middle of the fields like it did the year before. If you were in the LNID, you're well aware of the water and irrigation issues we had in the spring. That's a whole other topic that could be an episode in itself. Shallow or late seeded fields saw poor emergence and thin stands at first. Dry soil and temperature swings slowed crop development and benefited weeds and insects. There was very little crop competition for a lot of weeds this year once they got emerged. There was some Fusarium root rot found, but overall minimum. Fusarium is generally the pathogen that is going to affect our cereal crops when it is hot and dry. Pythium is usually more of a wet and cold disease. This picture here is some canola. This was seeded in dry soil in May. This canola seed was pretty much scratched in at about 1/4 of an inch deep. We were hoping we were going to get a rain shower and it would germinate quickly. Of course it didn't. There was a couple of small rain showers of 1 or 2 millimeters, and that did help some of it come up. About 20 to 30% of the crop emerged from the ground, mostly where it was seeded the deepest on some hilltops and high spots. And where it was really shallow and dry, it did not emerge until we got some consistent rain in June. So pretty big difference in the maturity rates in this field. Here's my little helper. So herbicide season, we didn't have the crazy high temperatures of the 21 season where like first week of June we were hitting 38 degrees. But on average, our temperatures for June this year were consistently hotter overall. So kochia, Russian thistle, and other drought-tolerant weeds were very competitive with crops. I would also throw lamb's quarters in on this list as well. I had more problems with lamb's quarters than ever before. Fields that didn't receive pre-burn were particularly bad. And that was because there was a lot of really small kochia that wasn't immediately observable. And it did have a few days head start on a lot of the cereal crops, and it was large enough at herbicide timing that it was very difficult to get under control. There is widespread 2, 4, and 9 resistance and tolerance, which reduced the effectiveness of many herbicides. Definitely starting to see quite a lot of group 4 tolerance in kochia. Dry conditions did add stress to crops. I'm not going to lie, there was some herbicides out there that did cause some stress to some of the crop when it was in drought stress. And there was very little for disease presence, even in irrigated fields, probably due to a little bit of a low spore load from last year. But there was a few things like net blotch and scald, which did show up in dryland barley, but it wasn't anything really severe. This chart is off of the One Soil platform, so this shows kind of NDVI versus growing degree days, precipitation, and the vegetation index from the NDVI. So this is a wheat field, this was dryland, this was up by barrens, and you can kind of see here there's a big dip in the NDVI, the vegetation index, kind of towards the end of May here. That's actually the period around May long weekend where the temperature was in the high 30s for a couple days. So that crop was tillering and in vegetative growth, and it really took a beating there. Condition of it really started to go down. And right around that time, it did receive a couple rain showers as well, which actually brought it back. And then you can see it starting to go into stress again early June. A couple more little showers bring it back, and then it goes into stress again. And then we ended up with our big rainfall event on June 14th. And then after that, we were into heading. So pretty interesting. This software will produce a chart like this for every field, which is actually pretty cool to follow along with. But the weather data on here is just kind of general for the area. It's not specifically tailored for that field, so you may see some differences there. But a lot of these fields like this one were very close to complete failure until we'd gotten that rain in June 14th, which in this area dropped 60 to 80 millimeters of rain, and catastrophic hail and others. Early in June here, we had some interesting stuff showing up with fairy rings. So for the most part, I found the south of Lethbridge around the McGrath area seemed pretty widespread. The top picture here is a pea field. You can see there's all these overlapping rings. Some of them are pretty big, some of them are pretty small. Very interesting to see when you stuck a shovel into the ground in the ring, you would pull up all this white stuff. This is all the mycelium, the underground fungal growth. And that soil was completely dry. There was almost no moisture in it at all. So it was really interesting to see that. It never did develop any fruiting bodies or above ground mushrooms, which made it very difficult to identify. So we never really did figure out exactly what species of fungus this was. Here's a picture of ankle wheat. This was June 13th. Early seeded dryland cereals were extremely stressed and pushing out heads. Lower leaves were dying off to conserve moisture. At this time, a lot of these crops were also causing tillers to abort, and they were dropping off pretty rapidly. This is the next day, June 14th. We had some pretty major thunderstorms roll through the area, but it was not really a general area, like general rainfall through the area. So there was definitely some hot spots like this area here, which was between Fort Macleod and Nobleford, where it dropped up to 4 inches of hail. This canola field was about a mile away from where that picture was taken, and this was the next morning. This was CP21T3P, which is a True Flex canola from Crop Plan. It did eventually make a full recovery and ended up being one of my best canola fields this year, even though it was thinned out a little bit by the hail. This is another picture resulting from the June 14th storm. I think this picture was about a week later. This is northeast of Kehoe Lake, and you can kind of see the hail track in this picture running from west to east. So this whole section here was right in the center of it pretty much, and the barley went from basically like boot stage down to mowed off completely. We actually went in and picked rocks in this field because we didn't think it was going to recover, and it eventually did. So yeah, the other thing was it did cause a big flush of weeds to emerge in many cases after herbicide had been applied and crop was out of staging, so we had a lot of wild oats emerging in a lot of the dryland fields after this storm. It also did cause some of the really stressed cereal fields to start pushing out new tillers to replace ones that had already dropped off. July, more hot and dry and smoky. It was consistently hot and dry all month with isolated thunderstorms hitting some fields and not others, so depending on which weather station you look at, all these shower amounts could be radically different. In some areas you might have gotten double what this was, or you might have gotten absolutely nothing. So small showers, for the most part too little too late, but did help to fill some heads. Pretty much it just kept kind of nursing the crop along and keeping it from going into total failure. The smoky conditions likely did help us by keeping temperatures slightly lower on average. We didn't get too many really high temperatures until you get kind of towards the end of July there. July 24th looks like we hit 36 degrees Celsius, so very hot. Canola flowered for the most part starting the 3rd week of June. As normal, first to flower, first to spray. Cabbage seed pod weevil was widespread, as it always is, but very few severe fields. After I would say the first initial week of the season, the numbers kind of dropped off and stayed low for the most part for the rest of the season. Lygus numbers were initially low, but exploded later in potting. Nothing unusual there for a hot year. Lygus have a very fast reproductive rate when it's hot. Diamondback showed up early July, but no issues. Diamondback is another one that does really good in hot, dry weather. However, I think there was enough predatory insects keeping the numbers under control that there was no real issues with them this year. Alfalfa looper and armyworm, there was some outbreaks. There was definitely some hot spots. I think partially that might have been because alfalfa looper was feeling the pressure to get out of, forage fields or fields that were burning up. Grasshoppers are a problem in many fields as ditches and grasslands dried up. Definitely saw this. If you had any sort of green field next to, native pasture, it probably got hit pretty hard by grasshoppers. There was severe flower blasting in some fields due to heat and drought. I monitored a lot of fields for this. I didn't notice any one variety being any worse than the others. It just depended on where they were and whether they'd gotten rain showers or not and what time they were flowering. Aster yellows did make an appearance, but very low incidence, and for the most part it wasn't really obvious until into August. Here we got some grasshopper stripping irrigated canola July 26th. This was up by Carmen Gay, and this irrigated canola had a dryland wheat field right next to it that had completely burned up, and the grasshoppers had just moved in mass into this field and had completely eaten all of the pods off of several acres of canola. Here we've got, this was a durum crop. You can see the drift dead grasshoppers along the bottom. This coragen had been applied about 2 weeks earlier. This was on July 17th. Lots of dryland crops were very thin and stressed. This one on the left here is the same field you saw the NDVI and weather overlay of earlier, so you can see how stressed out it is here, how much bare ground we have between the rows. You can also inadvertently, this picture kind of shows another thing in the upper left corner there. That is a symptom of when you have a low spot in a field, the seed drill doesn't go in quite deep enough, you end up with some shallow place seed, and that seed wouldn't have germinated until probably into June, so it's significantly farther behind. And the peas on the right, you can see how thin we are there. That was a very, very dry field, and we had pretty poor emergence on that, although it did yield decently in the end. And we had issues with weeds continually germinating from small showers. Kochia, it seems you can just probably spit on the ground and germinate a few plants. And you can see here in this durum, we've got kochia that's 2/3 of the height of the durum, and yes, it is covered in grasshoppers here as well, which is why I took the picture here. They are not actually eating it, they are just using it as kind of a scaffold to climb up in the morning to sun themselves and warm up for the day. Observations at this time: the earliest seeded dryland crops did have the best start, but did suffer the most later on. Early to mid-May seeding dates seemed to be the best on average. Mid to late May saw poor emergence with shallow seeding, but some did pretty well if they did catch showers. Low areas with reserved moisture produced a good crop, like in this overhead image here of this barley field. You can see those dryland areas on the hilltops are just burning right off, but you can see all those low spots are all just doing absolutely wonderful. So there was also spotty problems with wheat mosaic. It was probably more widespread this year than I've ever seen before, but for the most part on dryland we had other things to worry about. Harvest begins mostly around the first week of August. Small inconsistent showers early in the month did slow harvest. August 21st, we had the first meaningful, and I would say the first general meaningful rain since June or earlier, depending on the area. It did cover most of my area and dropped some decent rain. A little variable in it, but at least it was something. Dryland peas and barley were generally the first to come off. The first fields to come off were usually the worst. They were generally the first seeded and the most stressed. That August 21st rain did cause some pretty serious issues with canola regrowth. A lot of the BSF probably takes more flack about this than anyone else, but a lot of the canola, when it is prematurely ripening and dying from drought stress, when it suddenly gets a shot of moisture like that, it can rapidly regrow and start pushing out new flowers. And overall yields were better than expected. This was the one thing that most of my guys were quite surprised by, was they were expecting to get, almost nothing or under 10 bushels, and instead come off with 25 or 30 bushels of barley. So dryland yields, these are, this is not exact. This is mostly from what people have been telling me and some of my data off of Farmer's Edge and stuff like that as well. So barley, for the most part, fields averaged anywhere from 9 to 70 bushels, but I would say the average was probably in the 30s. Wheat, 5 to 40 bushels, some were even higher than that, but most of the dryland probably averaged in the 20s. Durum would have been less than that. It seems like durum is a little slower to get going, and it flowers a little bit later, and it really suffered in comparison to the wheat and tended to have more sawfly problems as well. Yellow peas average kind of between 20 and 40 bushels, probably closer to the 20 on average. Lentils mostly in the 10 to 20 range. I didn't hear too much over the teens. Canola, 5 to 40 bushels. Some canola fields were particularly bad and looked it as well. Some came off in the high 30s, so just kind of depended on where you were and if you caught the showers. Other harvest issues: we had variable maturity due to seedling issues and moisture, drought tolerant green weeds that didn't have crop competition, so there was a lot of green kochia and lamb's quarters out there in particular that was difficult to deal with some combines. Huge amount of grasshoppers, so I know some guys were having trouble with the amount of grasshoppers in their tank in the combine. There was elevated fire risk because of how hot and dry it was. A lot of our crops were very short. There was a lot of reports of people hitting rocks. Sawfly, there was definitely some major hot spots. They can take down a crop pretty fast. If you are going to hit 20% lodging, you should consider swathing to reduce loss from sawfly, but if the numbers are bad, you can go from 5 to 20% lodging in a couple days, so it's something you really got to keep on top of. There was definitely lots of pre-harvest spraying was done, both for crop maturity as well as weed control at the time. Observations: deep seeding worked best within reason. Obviously you can't seed canola 2 inches down, but you can go an inch, even an inch and a quarter, if that means getting into the moisture. Yield was determined by moisture more than any other factor. We can see this, same variety between fields or even within a field. An extremely good year overall for the kochia crop. There's definitely going to be a big seed bank for next year, and group 4 herbicides are a poor solution for kochia in a dry year. If you were relying on a group 4 like a fluroxypyr for broadleaf weed control, you probably noticed you had pretty poor control on kochia this year. Did biologicals help? More consistent emergence compared to control is relatively normal to see with most of the biological products. This was an experiment that I kind of did here using Humaterra. You can see the first cell here is control, the next cell is Nature's Aid, which is a liquid humic acid product. The next series of cells is Humaterra, and then the last series is Humaterra plus Nature's Aid. So the Humaterra treated cells did see emergence. This is tomato seeds, did see emergence a couple days ahead of control, and it was quite impressive. Those plants were off to a head start pretty much all season long, but yeah, it doesn't necessarily translate into yield. If you build a bigger plant with a bigger root system, you increase evapotranspiration in that plant, and it can actually dry up faster than the control in drought situations. Here's an overhead image. This is out of one soil. This was a Humaterra field that we had out by Summerview, and right up to this date you can see the line in the field where it was applied versus where it wasn't. I don't think I have to tell you which side was applied. But it was the north. So after this image here, the next week it started to show no difference from one side to the other, and according to the customer, the field completely burnt up and went down in a real hurry. This was canola. I don't have any yield map on it yet, so I can't say whether one side yielded better than the other, but it wouldn't surprise me if we don't see any results. So keep you posted on that one. VR rate responses. This can be a controversial opinion. The whole idea of it is basically to focus your resources on areas that produce more consistently, theoretically can help even out uneven fields. This was our first year with Agroplus using the OneSoil platform to generate these maps and this data for customers. So we didn't have very many fields for our first season, but overall we had some pretty positive results. And by that I mean the customers are happy, they want to do it again. So still waiting on yield data. I need to go out and pull that out of a few combines so I can run some analysis on that. You can see on this map, I went into this field not with the idea of saving the producer on fertilizer, but kind of redistributing some from the worst areas of the field that don't produce to the best areas that do produce. And you can see some of these strange squares in the field. Those are actually check strips that are automatically put in. And when we put the harvest data in here, it'll run a report and tell us whether any of those rate changes were successful. So contact us for more information on OneSoil if that's something you're interested in trying out. Post-harvest. We had a very early crop, and once the crop was removed, weeds took advantage of those late showers. Drought-hardened weeds and large kochia were extremely difficult to control, as you can see in that picture on the left there. We did have a great opportunity to control Canada thistle regrowth before the killing frost, although actually Canada thistle in my area wasn't terribly bad this year. It was also a good opportunity because of the time to harrow the canola stubble and encourage volunteer canola growth. We'd rather get that up in the fall so it dies out over the winter with frost rather than have to fight it in the spring. A lot of the canola stubble regrew after getting those showers, and right up until we got that snow here in October, there was quite a few yellow canola fields out there, and I think a few guys were hoping to not have to put their combine away and get a better second crop. Here on our weather chart, you can see it seemed like an abrupt change to fall weather kind of mid-September there. Fall annuals such as stinkweeds started to emerge. I started to notice the first stinkweeds kind of coming up around, our first week of October there. And our soil temperatures became optimal for fall applied residuals October 13th. So that'd be products like Volterra, Authority, Focus, Fierce, and Zidua. Winter wheat overall was developing very well up till this time as well. Grasshoppers were still active in laying eggs up till October 20th, so I would expect to see some spring pressure from them. And there was still lots of time for fall fertilizing operations to go on, so if that's something you're interested in, ask any of us about replenished nutrients. We've got some granular that can be surface applied here this fall. So one of the lessons that we learned in the 2023 season, well, the first one should be that irrigation yields higher. You should probably have more pivots. Seed as deep as reasonably possible if the soil is drying out. Can't count on spring rains to germinate quarter-inch seeded canola. The risk with this is if we don't have decent rainfall in the forecast and you're seeding shallow to try to catch some of those showers. If you don't have moisture underneath that seed and you just get 2 or 3 millimeters of rain, it might be enough to get that seed to germinate, but then that seed is only going to have a limited amount of time to get its roots down deeper into that moisture. If there is no moisture down there and it runs out, then it's going to desiccate and dry up and you will lose it and you'll have a pretty thin stand. And I've seen that happen quite a few times the last 2 years. Soil active herbicides are best applied in fall. This spring there was quite a few problems with soil active herbicides that were sprayed as pre-burn and they didn't receive enough moisture to activate properly, or they might activate in certain areas of the field and not in others. Gophers are best controlled as soon as they emerge, not after the grass is green. Assume all kochia is group 2 and 9 resistant and tolerant to group 4. Roundup Ready and True Flex canola are no longer a great fit on dryland with kochia. You should be considering Liberty Link or a stacked trait canola instead. 10 years ago, I would have told you that a Liberty Link canola was a poor way to control kochia compared to Roundup. That has now completely reversed, and it's not because Liberty is any better on kochia than it used to be. It's just that Liberty is very good on kochia, while kochia is very small. So if you can use Liberty early to burn off kochia before it's 2 inches tall, then you'll have pretty good control. Fields that missed pre-burn were a mess in June, and hit grasshoppers hard and early. It's harder to control them once they're adults, and that's because they move around so much. When they're small and they're concentrated in those hot spots, you don't have to spend much money to get those under control. And of course, hindsight is 20/20, so now everything looking back seems obvious, but it wasn't at the time. This is an interesting thing that's going to be coming up here. Our solar maximum is due to peak in roughly January to October of 2024. So this is about an 11-year cycle of increased activity on the sun, which means more CMEs, which is coronal mass ejections. And yeah, so that can kind of affect our weather here on Earth a little bit. Potential for higher temperatures. But, you know, maybe that might mean we have another drought year. Can also mean GPS problems. Solar flares and CMEs can cause issues with satellites and potentially even knock them off of their designated path. So that can mean that your accuracy or your GPS system might go from 1 meter to, say, 10 meters. So, interesting thing to keep an eye on. Our 2024 weather forecast. What's it going to do this coming season? Of course, if I could predict this, I'd be, multi-millionaire probably. But yeah, right now all indications are still showing El Nino is expected to remain strong for the 2024 season. They're saying probably up into June, so we could expect to be hot and dry pretty much up until then. Typically, this means that the southern U.S. is going to be cold and wet, and Alberta will be warm and dry. If you're a Farmer's Almanac believer, they are predicting a cold, wet winter for Alberta, but they also predicted we were going to be a hot, wet summer. In my opinion, they couldn't predict their way out of a paper bag most years. What are you going to do different for the next year? Well, I'm only just starting to look at some soil sample results now, but it's very likely that there's going to be some pretty decent fertility left in the soil in many areas. Are you going to try using taller stubble to trap more spring snow? Maybe try a stripper header. Leave all of your stubble there. There's some newer Group 27 herbicides that should be adapted for kochia control. Group 27 is pretty effective if we can, especially on smaller canola if we're going in early, but there is some concerns with that if you have pulses in the rotation. Are you going to change your rotation around? You're going to maybe do, less canola, less durum, stick with barley because it's a little bit more drought tolerant. Solid stem varieties to fight sawfly. Some of these areas have been pretty hard on sawfly the last couple of years. Some of my guys are definitely starting to switch and starting to go to solid stem varieties. Are you going to try to, save a little bit of money or increase your efficiency in inputs by trying VR? Maybe reduce your fertilizer inputs on those hilltops if you're expecting another dry year. Are you going to seed deeper? That's the number one thing that most of my guys did this year was they listened to me and they seeded deeper, and we had much better emergence than we did the year before because of that. And a little bit of a joke, but I know some guys have been talking about going back to using summer fallow to save water. The background imagery on this slide here, this is the north end of a canola field, and it was actually a little bit of a herbicide drift was why I initially went to this field. The wheat across the fence line there to the north was sprayed with Infinity. That Infinity drifted into the canola. Of course, canola does not like Infinity, so it turned yellow and it kind of bleached it. But there was way more damage being done in this field by the gophers than there ever was from the Infinity. You can see how many holes there is in this area here. So, and of course, once canola is up and in this stage, you're never going to be able to really get gophers under control. They would much rather eat this nice tender green canola than they would chew on some bait. And of course, if you want more, like and subscribe on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. I got, I think about 3 years worth of videos up on YouTube now here, so check that out.